Hello, wonderful and capable economics students. This is going to be just a short discussion of what to do with your children's book that you've brought today in terms of writing your paper, just to be sure that everybody's on the same page, and I have a chance to talk to you a little bit about each of the parts now that you have your book in your hand. You'll also be able to access this video online after watching it together, so if you feel over the weekend that you're not sure about any part of it, you can go back and watch this just to be sure that you do the best you can and hopefully get all the points possible simply because you followed the directions and you did a good job. So, you'll recall that at the top of your paper, your directions were to find a children's book that illustrates 4 to 6 economic principles. And today you will begin working on and finish over the weekend a 2-page paper. This paper needs to be double-spaced, it needs to be 12-point font. Spelling and grammar do count to a point. If there are numerous errors in it that make it difficult to read, you will lose points for that. In terms of this length requirement, if you write a paper in the spirit of what is required here, and you try to do your best and you explain things adequately, your paper will end up being 2 pages. There's no need to have a huge title or type your name and push enter 10 times or anything like that. You just want to write a paper that fulfills the 4 requirements on your half sheet that I'm going to go over in this short presentation. If you do and it ends up being 2.5 pages, great. If you do and it ends up being 1.5 pages, that's fine too, but you must fulfill these 4 requirements accurately and enough to warrant the credit, which I'll be talking about as we go along here. So, those were the basic requirements. You should have a book in hand. If you do not, Mrs. Klump has been instructed to help you out a little bit and give you a book to use. You must return this book to me before I'll grade your paper. So to get credit for the paper, you have to return your sample book. And you must take one of these books today. Your homework was to bring a book, and if you did not, you will sacrifice the 3 points I mentioned when I gave you the assignment, and you will borrow a book. There's no, oh, I just forgot mine, but I know the story. If you do not have a book in hand, you will borrow one today and use that book for your paper. So that said, let's take a look at how these papers will be written. Number 1, paragraph 1 of your paper is a brief description of your book's storyline. There's no introduction in this paper that says, oh, economics is everywhere, blah, blah, blah. You are simply telling the story of your book. And you remember last time I read to you or told you about my little book, The Clock Book, and I really just told you the story of how this is about a little girl who's learning to tell time. Her parents work at their clock and watch shop that they own. She has a brother. She has a kitty clock in her room. We just mention a few of the features of the story and tell the story briefly. This paragraph, this first paragraph, which essentially is your introduction, will probably be between 6 and 8 sentences long. If you need a few more sentences to really get the story out, go ahead. But this paragraph should not extend onto the second page. Be brief, summarize the events in your book, and then move on to 2, 3, and 4, which are the real meat of the paper. So once you've written paragraph 1 and just briefly gone over your storyline, the next 2 steps are listed here, and you can see them on number 2 and 3 of your paper. You need to discuss what economic principles apply to your story. And then further, with number 3, you need to discuss what those economic principles are, kind of from our theory perspective, our knowledge perspective, given that we've had access to resources like the book, and what role they play in our larger economic system. So, number 2, or this first bullet right here, is about what principles are hidden or even overt in your story. Number 3 is from you. It's from your brain and what you've learned this quarter about economics in the real world. Okay, so you are actually using what you've learned in number 3 and talking about what you've learned sort of away from the book. Now, I sort of alluded to this last time, but I'll give you an example using my clock book. So I mentioned that the parents own the clock shop. And we see here at 9 o'clock, Mom and Dad open up their clock shop. It's attached to our house, so I can spend time there whenever I like. These 2 people, this young girl's mom and dad, are entrepreneurs. She talks about what they do. They sell all kinds of clocks and watches and fix broken ones too. So more evidence that they own a small business and are entrepreneurs that own a clock and watch shop. Then she goes inside and she talks about all the different kinds of clocks and watches there are, and this is just one of those pages. There are cases full of watches. Some of them have numbers or marks on their faces and hands that point out the time. And she goes on to talk about some of the other kinds of watches. This is clear evidence of a market economy, at least, and likely a capitalist economy, because there's choices. Remember that choice is a benefit of the price system. And there's lots of choices to be had here. We could also say that this might be connected to the idea of consumer taste and preferences, because people are able to get the watch that they like because the demand for different kinds of watches and different styles must be high. But definitely this is evidence of choice in a market economy, which is a benefit to us as consumers. So I could talk about that there. Here's an example where Dad is ordering parts and keeping track of everything in his record books. She says down here, like all the clocks and watches and customers and money. So Dad must clearly be the guy that kind of does the books. Then she goes on to say on the very next page that Mom fixes the clocks, and in fact she can fix just about any kind of clock and take them apart and then put all the little pieces back together again perfectly, which sounds like a nice but tedious job. This acts between the mom and the dad, where the dad kind of does the books and the mom works on fixing the clocks and watches, is clearly specialization. It increases the efficiency of their business for each of them to kind of specialize in some of the tasks rather than both of them trying to do all of them. So there are two more economic terms that are sort of hidden but present in this children's book. So while kids are learning about telling time, which was the purpose of the story, they're also learning about these features of what's going on around them and how that stuff works. So I've talked to you about number 2. These are where the economic concepts are kind of hidden or even overt in some cases in the story. Here's specialization with these two working on different jobs. This is an example of choice in a market economy, which is a benefit of the price system. We talk here about how her parents are entrepreneurs, and so they have a small business. And then here's the other page where they are talking about having their clock and watch shop, which makes them entrepreneurs. So those are just 4 brief examples of economic principles. So I've done number 2, and that's exactly what you'll do in paragraph 2, is just tell me literally where are the concepts in your story. Who or what is an example of these various concepts? And you're going to write that out in a narrative form, of course, in a paragraph to tell me where those economic concepts are present. Now, number 3 then, or the third paragraph, is bringing those concepts sort of into the big picture kind of thing that we've been learning about. So, what you'll want to say in that third paragraph compared to the second one is that entrepreneurship is the act of combining the other factors of production and taking a risk to start a small business. And it is important in the United States economy because we have many small businesses, and it provides people with jobs and us with new choices and competition for goods and services. So you see, number 3 asks you what are the principles kind of in real life and what role do they play in our economic system. So I explained kind of the definition of entrepreneurship in my own words, and I said why it was important. I would do the same thing with choice. I would explain that that's a feature of the price system and a benefit to consumers, and I would say why it benefits and how it gives us lots of choices and different styles at different prices. This example of specialization, I would talk about how specialization is valuable to a business. I would say what specialization is. I could add into my discussion the definition of efficiency, or you see the little tools that she's using. Of course, those are examples of capital resources, so I could also define capital resources as the manufactured products that people use to complete their services, and I could say why those are important in an economy. But number 3 is the real stuff. What's the actual definition, kind of in your own words again, and why does it matter in the economy? How does it benefit us to know about it? So that's number 2 and number 3. Now, To some of you, in terms of your writing and how you've been being taught to increase the sophistication of your writing, all of you have been taught this over the last few years, it will make more sense to do number 2 and 3 together, kind of alternating, where I might say the girl's mom and dad are example of entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurship is the combination of the factors of production, etc., etc. So I would explain both 2 and 3, and then go on to my next example, which was choice in a market economy. You can do this as well. You'll still probably get 2 paragraphs out of it, keeping in mind that the general rule for a paragraph is definitely no more than 8 sentences and probably 6 or 7. But you need to be sure you do both 2 and 3. Say where it is in the story and give us a kind of a definition of it in your own words and why it's important. Just be sure you do 2 and 3. You can do them sort of alternatingly together, or you can do them in 2 completely separate paragraphs. If that is kind of fuzzy, just do the 2 separate paragraphs. So, once you've written those 3 paragraphs, your last step is to deal with number 4 on the list. And just like it says on your half sheet, number 4 is to, as a conclusion, talk about how economics might continue to impact the story, if it was continued, the story itself. And the way you do this is to add 2 new ideas. You should write that on your half sheet, please. Add 2 new ideas to the story that we've learned about this quarter. So, for example, I might say that as the story continued, a new clock shop opened just down the street from the little girl's house and her parents' clock shop. That increases competition, which is a supply shifter, and it will shift the supply of clocks and watches to the right. So I can say exactly what I just said. I will say that there's a new shop in town, it increases competition, and the supply of clocks and watches shifts to the right. I have to correctly apply 2 new concepts. So I don't have to define competition as a supply shifter or anything like that. I just have to say what happens and what will happen because of it. And then for my second thing, I might say, for example, that the government then steps in and because of some terrible watch shortage begins rationing watches, and because of that rationing, her parents start to participate in a black market where clocks and watches are sold at much higher values than what they're really worth. So you can see where my second example here off the top of my head is maybe not quite as appropriate as some others I might be able to think of. You want them to be plausible examples, and both of those are somewhat plausible. You can't make aliens land and, the whole thing becomes a command system or something like that. You want to keep it connected to the story somehow. But the goal of number 4 is, again, to correctly apply 2 new ideas that you haven't used so far in your paper that we've learned this quarter in economics, and apply them somehow to your story. So you do not have to define them or talk about them in the real world, but just make them happen in your story and explain how that would impact the story. So your conclusion will probably only be 4 or 5 sentences long. Again, it will not end with, and so we've proven economics is everywhere, or anything like that. Your conclusion is your continuation of the story. It's not a summary of what you've written about up to this point or anything like that. So it's a little different than maybe a typical paper requirement. So those are the details I really wanted to be able to talk to you about today, even though I'm not there. I know you're in excellent hands, and I know that you'll get a lot of work done today. You'll be reviewing a little bit for the test at the end of the period. If you are unsure about any aspect of this paper, because I will expect that it will fulfill these things I've just gone over, you can do 2 things. There will be a website written on the board, on the whiteboard in the computer lab, and it's also on the chalkboard if you look up there now, that is a link to this video so that you can watch it again if you're unsure. Or if you have a specific question for me, you can email me at the at the email address that you see, which is the one you can access through Parent Portal. So be sure that if you aren't sure, you ask some questions to be sure that you do the best job that you can. And I hope that you have a great day and a great weekend studying, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week.